You could taste the fire in the air, sharp and metallic, drifting down the blackened foothills of eastern Arizona like a warning. For Ella Carter, the scent of wildfire was as familiar as old sweat or engine grease, both of which clung to her skin as she eased her battered Ford F1 150 over a stretch of cracked, smoking road. Her hands trembled a little on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from exhaustion. This was her fourth rescue in 3 days. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours in a row since the inferno swallowed half the state line. Ash fluttered past her windshield like ghostly snow. The sun glowed red and angry behind a haze so thick it was hard to tell if it was dusk or midday. Ella slowed, headlights sweeping over the cindered landscape, charred sagebrush, twisted wire, scorched fence posts. She kept her radio turned low, the familiar static of the local fire crew's updates only broken by the occasional panicked call for help. But as she rolled past what had once been a cattle gate, something new caught her ear. A cry. Not human. Thin, desperate, a sound she'd recognize in her bones. She slammed on the brakes, heart thrumming, and jumped out into the heavy, acrid air. The world was muffled, strange. Her boots crunched through brittle, blackened grass as she followed the whimpering noise. Her lungs burned with every breath. The animal sanctuary she'd built from nothing was 15 miles behind her, but duty never ended at the gate. Ella pressed on, eyes darting between the trees, until she saw it. A metal cage. Abandoned. Maybe 4 feet long, warped by the heat. And inside, tangled in soiled straw and matted with soot, was a foal, so thin she could see the outline of ribs, nose pressed to the bars, legs trembling as he tried to stand. His eyes were too big for his face. He looked up at her, silent now, terror and hope in one haunted stare. Ella's first instinct was anger, raw and sharp at whoever had left him like this. But there was no time for rage. The wind was changing, smoke twisting around her ankles. Somewhere behind her, a dry pine snapped and toppled, flames hissing as they licked across the earth. She knelt, coughing, and tugged at the cage's ancient lock. Her hands shook harder now, slick with sweat and soot. "It's okay, little one," she murmured, voice rough. "I've got you." But the lock wouldn't budge, rusted shut by years of rain and now seared by the fire's wrath. She reached for the emergency bolt cutters slung over her shoulder, military habit she'd never shaken off. The handles bit into her palms as she squeezed, metal groaning in protest, then snapping with a jagged clang. The cage door wrenched open, swinging wide. Ella reached in, sliding her arms around the foal's narrow chest. He was lighter than he should have been, barely more than skin and bone. And he didn't fight, just shivered against her. That was when she heard it. Another sound, heavier, more purposeful. The hush of movement in the ashes. She spun, heart pounding, ready for a wild dog. Or worse. Instead, through the haze, a shape emerged. A mare. Silver gray, wild as the wind, coat streaked with scars and ash. Her eyes burned gold and hard, locking on Ella, who froze, foal still in her arms. The mare was taller than any Mustang Ella had ever seen, muscle rippling beneath her battered skin, mane tangled with burrs and cinders. She could have charged. She could have crushed Ella where she stood, but she didn't. Instead, the mare stepped closer, head low, breath steaming in the cold shadow of the fire. Ella held her ground, every muscle ready to run, but the foal whinnied softly. A sound so helpless that it cracked the silence like glass. The mare's ears flicked. She sniffed the air, then leaned forward and nuzzled the foal through the open cage, her lips trembling as she checked him over, almost like counting ribs, making sure he was real. For a heartbeat, Ella and the mare simply stared at each other. Woman and wild thing, equal in the face of something far larger and more dangerous than either could face alone. A gust of wind howled through the blackened trees, carrying with it a wall of heat. Flames leapt higher, hungry for more. Ella knew they had seconds at most. She adjusted her grip, the foal barely able to hold up his own head. The mare tossed her mane, eyes following Ella's every move, not with fear, but with something Ella couldn't name. When she turned to go, The mare didn't block her path. Instead, she stepped aside, as if to say, "Go. I trust you." Ella sprinted back to her truck, arms full of foal, heart thrumming so loud she thought it would burst. She slid into the cab, cradling the tiny, shivering body as she started the engine. Out her window, flames reflected in the mare's eyes, but she didn't flinch. As Ella pulled away, the mare followed, silent as a ghost, hooves sinking into the ashen soil. Not a rope in sight, not a bridle, not a promise of safety. Only trust, a promise stronger than any chain. Behind her, the wildfire raged, devouring the earth in its path. But ahead, two survivors, one human, one wild, and the foal whose life now hung by a thread, moved together into the unknown. She didn't follow a rope. She followed a promise. Sunrise burned away the worst of the smoke, but the world still felt like a fever dream. As Ella Carter's battered pickup rolled slowly down the winding highway, the scorched landscape unspooled around her, ash-dusted hills, pockets of blackened forest, silence where birdsong once lived. In the cab beside her, the foal trembled against a wool blanket, his breathing shallow, his every muscle taut from fear and exhaustion. Ella kept her right hand on the wheel and her left resting on his tiny neck, feeling the thready pulse that told her he was still clinging to life. The world outside the window remained gray and blurred, but one shape stood out, sharp and unwavering: the wild mare. Ella checked her rearview mirror for the 5th time in 2 miles and saw her there, pacing behind the truck with a grace that seemed to defy gravity and pain. Sierra, though Ella did not know her name yet, kept exactly 10 paces behind the tailgate, head lowered, nostrils flaring as she navigated the chaos the wildfire had left behind. With each curve of the road, each pothole, each tumbleweed scorched black, Sierra followed. The drive should have taken 30 minutes. It took over an hour. Ella slowed, not wanting to force the mare too hard, watching as the wild horse trotted through the dust, never breaking stride, never hesitating, not once. Cars passed, now and then, most loaded with evacuees or fire crews, but one old Dodge slowed beside Ella's truck. The driver, a rancher she half knew from the grain store, gawked, then reached for his phone. Moments later, Ella glimpsed him holding it out the window, filming as Sierra trailed her battered truck like some strange, silent shadow. At first, Ella thought little of it, but by the time they reached the crossroads before Willow Ridge Refuge, she noticed another car stopped. The driver snapping photos, a couple of teenagers waving their phones excitedly. The story was already outpacing her. She turned up the cracked gravel road toward the sanctuary. Her sanctuary, a modest sprawl of wooden barns, patched fences, and sun-bleached corrals tucked between the hills. Ella eased the truck to a halt, dust rising around her in slow spirals. She turned, opening the passenger door and gathering the weak foal in her arms. The mare stopped at the gate, chest heaving, flanks streaked with ash and sweat, eyes locked on Ella's every move. The sanctuary was chaos, as always. Dogs barked from the main house porch, chickens scattered underfoot. A pair of rescued donkeys brayed in protest as Ella carried the foal up the path. At the corral, she spread a fresh blanket in a bed of hay and set him down gently, brushing the soot from his face with trembling hands. The foal, dusty, she whispered to herself, was nearly spent, legs folded awkwardly beneath him. Sierra watched from beyond the fence, unmoving. When Ella turned, she saw the mare hesitate only a moment before stepping forward, pushing the gate with her nose until it swung wide. She crossed the threshold as if she belonged, her hooves silent on the trampled earth. Instead of panicking, Sierra made her way to Dusty, lowering her head and nudging his tiny, trembling frame. The foal responded with a feeble nicker, his eyes lighting up as his mother settled beside him, standing guard. Ella held her breath, unsure if she should approach or stay back. Sierra's gaze never left her, but there was no wild panic, no threat, only the deep, unspoken need of a mother refusing to leave her child. That day, Sierra would not touch food or water. Each time Ella brought out a bucket or a flake of hay, Sierra stood over Dusty, refusing a single bite until the foal took his first shaky mouthful. If Dusty drank, so would she. If not, She waited, body tense, eyes never wavering from the frail shape at her feet. News travels fast in small towns. By midday, the phones were ringing nonstop. Neighbors asking about the wildfire, firemen checking for stray livestock, and soon, local reporters. "Is it true?" they asked. "A wild Mustang followed you 5 miles? On foot?" Ella tried to brush it off. There were animals in need, lives to save, and too little time for fairy tales. But the questions kept coming. One video, shaky and dust-streaked, hit the internet by afternoon. A wild mare, covered in ash, trotting through the devastation, chasing a battered truck, captioned, "She chose to stay. She chose to follow." Within hours, the post had thousands of shares, comments pouring in from across the country. Some called it a miracle. Others claimed it had to be fake, a trick, or a tamed horse let loose for the cameras. But those who knew Ella, who'd seen the mare's scars and wariness, believed the truth. Sometimes, a wild animal makes her own decision, for reasons no human can fully grasp. Inside the sanctuary, Ella watched the mare and foal from the shadowed porch, arms folded, mind racing. She tended to Dusty, checking his wounds, dressing his sores, every movement gentle and slow. She moved with caution around Sierra, speaking softly, never forcing, always letting the mare decide how close she would allow. Over the hours, a fragile trust took root, not because of treats or cages, but because of silent company, the language of patience. Sierra watched every move, eyes bright and alert, but never threatened Ella, never turned to flee. As night fell, Willow Ridge grew quiet. The animals settled into their routines. In the far paddock, Dusty slept curled against Sierra's side, the mare standing vigil, head lowered over his frail body. Ella sat on the porch, her old dog curled at her feet, thinking about the strange journey of the day, the fire, the rescue, the miracle on the road. She wondered if Sierra would stay the night, or if by morning the wild mare would vanish into the hills, her work done. But as the moon rose high, silvering the fields, Sierra did not leave. She stood her post, protecting her foal, and in her silent watchfulness, Ella saw something more enduring than ownership or command. Out there, beneath the stars, it wasn't about the internet or what people believed. It was about a wild horse who chose, of her own will, to follow, not for food, not for safety, but for love. And as sleep finally claimed her, Ella understood. Trust wasn't taken. It was earned, step by silent step, mile by dusty mile. Morning light slipped gently over Willow Ridge, painting long golden stripes across the paddocks and the fields still scorched at their edges. Ella Carter woke to a familiar ache in her back and the soft sounds of the animals stirring. But her first thought, before coffee or even checking her phone, was the wild mare and her foal. The events of the past 2 days still hovered in her mind, unreal and yet as solid as the scars on her own hands. Before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline, Ella slipped into her worn boots and headed outside. The air was cooler now, the scent of fresh hay mingling with that faint, ever-present smoke. The world seemed paused at the edge of something fragile, new, and easily shattered. At the small corral, she found Dusty still alive, nestled in the deep straw, legs tucked under him like a newborn fawn. Sierra stood close, not sleeping but resting, her muzzle almost brushing the foal's back, her body forming a living shelter. The way she watched Ella was different now, still wary but less wild, as if recognizing the boundaries between threat and help. Ella approached slowly, keeping her movements smooth and predictable. She spoke softly, words barely more than a hum, and crouched just outside the fence, content to watch rather than intervene. She had learned, in her years with animals, especially the wounded ones, that sometimes silence was the only language that mattered. She watched as Sierra communicated with her foal, not with noise or obvious commands, but with the subtlety of breath and body. A flick of her ear would send Dusty's head turning. The shift of her weight, the way she lowered her neck, signaled whether it was safe to eat, to drink, or simply to rest. When Dusty tried to stand, legs trembling, Sierra pressed her nose gently into his side, encouraging, steadying, guiding him until he could manage a few shaky steps to the water trough. Not once did she push him too hard or let him wander far. Ella found herself awestruck, jotting quick notes on her phone. Uses posture to direct, never forces, just leads. She wondered how many human parents, herself included, missed the power of simple presence, the authority of stillness. As the morning wore on, a few locals stopped by, drawn by rumor and that viral video. Ella kept the visitors at a distance, but some watched quietly over the fence, marveling at the quiet choreography between mare and foal. An old rancher, hat in hand, murmured, "Never seen a wild one act that way. She's different." Another shook her head, whispering, "That's not just a horse, that's a story." For Ella, the internet fuss faded quickly. Her focus was always on Dusty and Sierra, their needs, their rhythms, the trust she was desperate not to break. She spent hours outside the corral, working through her chores, letting them get used to her presence. Whenever she moved too quickly or too close, Sierra would stiffen, nostrils flaring, eyes darting for escape. So Ella learned to slow down, to match the mare's energy, to keep her gaze soft and hands visible. When Dusty napped, Sierra would sometimes turn her attention to Ella. Not aggressive, not friendly, just watchful. Ella felt as though the mare was studying her in return, trying to understand the human's own body language, as if searching for proof that she meant no harm. One afternoon, Ella sat quietly with a bucket of water just beyond Sierra's reach, waiting. Hours ticked by, sun crawling across the sky, sweat beading on Ella's neck. At last, Dusty woke, nosed his mother, and tottered to the bucket. Only then did Sierra follow, drinking after her foal had finished. Ella understood. The mare was teaching the foal survival, not dependency but discernment, trust earned by patience. There was a moment mid-week when it seemed everything might come undone. A group of curious teens climbed the fence, phones in hand, laughing and calling out. Sierra whirled, body tense, teeth bared, not from malice, but terror. Dusty tried to run and stumbled, crying out. Ella raced over, hands up, shouting at the teens to back off. She herded them away, voice sharp, heart hammering. For a long time after, Sierra refused to let Ella near, even with food. The bond, so carefully built, felt shattered. But Ella refused to give up. She stayed near, silent, bringing water and hay, never pushing, just being present. She apologized out loud, voice shaking. She sang old lullabies under her breath, songs from her childhood and her army years, letting her voice fill the quiet. For 2 days, Sierra kept herself and Dusty at the far edge of the corral. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distance shrank again. It was during one golden evening, as the sky burned pink and blue, that Ella felt the shift. She knelt at the fence, repairing a loose board, when Sierra approached, close enough that Ella could smell the wild scent of her coat, see the flecks of gray in her mane. The mare stood there, ears forward, unafraid. Ella didn't reach out, didn't speak, didn't even breathe too loudly. She just stayed, steady and silent. Sierra dipped her head once, almost a nod, then turned back to Dusty. That night, Ella wrote in her notebook, "Some animals speak loudest when they say nothing at all." The days settled into a rhythm, Ella's chores, Sierra's silent lessons, Dusty's slow recovery. The sanctuary felt different now, quieter, more attentive, as if every creature understood something sacred was unfolding. Even the other animals kept their distance, dogs lying at the edges of the corral, eyes alert but calm. And always, at the heart of it all, the wild mare and her foal. A lesson in trust, in patience, in the quiet power of choosing to stay. The world outside buzzed with excitement, but inside Willow Ridge, everything was still, careful, and, at least for now, full of hope. The days drifted by in a slow, quiet rhythm at Willow Ridge. Dusty's strength returned little by little. With each sunrise, his steps grew steadier, his appetite heartier, though he still clung to Sierra's side as if she were the last safe thing on earth. Ella found herself falling into their world, a silent, deliberate place where patience did more good than any medicine, and trust was earned breath by breath. But just beneath the calm, there lingered questions that gnawed at Ella's peace. Sierra was unlike any wild horse Ella had known, not just in her devotion, but in the faint lines of her face, the way she watched Ella and the strange scars running under her coat. There was history here, Ella was sure. A story written in Sierra's body, hidden from the world. One chilly morning, as the sun burned fog off the lower pasture, Ella set about grooming Dusty. She moved slowly, her hands gentle, brushing the cinders from his coat and talking to him in soft, reassuring tones. Sierra stood close, never relaxed, but never threatening, her eyes fixed on Ella's every movement. As Ella worked her way down Dusty's back, she noticed the colt's coat was growing glossy again, patches of new hair covering the burns. She breathed a sigh of relief and reached for his flank. And that's when she noticed it. Just above Dusty's hip, barely visible beneath the new hair, was a faint, raised mark. It was shaped like a tiny horseshoe, half-healed and hard to see, the kind of thing you'd miss unless you were searching for it. Ella's heart skipped. She ran her fingers over the mark, then glanced at Sierra, wondering. Carefully, she inched closer to the mare, murmuring soft words and keeping her movements deliberate. Sierra stiffened at Ella's touch, but did not bolt. Instead, she locked eyes with Ella, nostrils flaring, muscles quivering beneath her skin. Ella lifted a handful of her mane, then traced along Sierra's left flank, and there, almost lost in the scars, was another brand. Older, faded, but unmistakable, a government mark. Ella's mind spun. She knew those symbols, brands given to wild horses adopted out of Bureau of Land Management roundups. She reached for her phone, snapped a quick photo, and sent it to her old Army friend, Nate, who now worked for the BLM up in Flagstaff. "You ever seen this brand?" she texted, her fingers trembling. The reply came quicker than she expected. "Yeah, that's one of ours. Give me a sec to look it up." Ella watched the sun creep higher, her heart heavy. She'd seen enough wild horse drama to know how complicated things could get. Some horses found new homes and good lives, but too many ended up shuffled from one unhappy place to another. And once the government's name was on them, they were never fully free. When Nate called, his voice was heavy with surprise. Ella, that mare, her record's strange. Adopted 3 years ago by a man out in Nevada. But there was an accident during transport, a trailer crash on I-15. 4 horses escaped. We never found them. Figured coyotes or the wilderness took care of it. Looks like your girl is one of the lucky ones. Ella looked out across the corral, watching Sierra stand protectively over Dusty. So she survived all that, crossed 2 states, and ended up here? Technically, Nate said, she's still government property. And if her original adopter wants her back, things could get messy. I'm supposed to report her, Ella. The weight of that hit Ella harder than she expected. The idea of someone tearing Sierra away after everything she'd survived felt wrong, cruel even. But the law didn't care about feelings, and the BLM had its protocols. "Give me some time," Ella pleaded. "She's not just some stray. She saved her foal, walked 5 miles behind my truck to get here. She deserves better than being shuttled around again." Nate sighed. "I'll hold off on the paperwork for now. But you need to be careful, Ella. If someone claims her, there's not much you can do." After she hung up, Ella stood at the fence, letting the news sink in. She watched Sierra and Dusty in the morning light, the bond between them unmistakable. The scars on Sierra's flank glowed silver in the sun, silent proof of the violence and chaos she'd escaped. Ella remembered the haunted look in the mare's eyes the day she'd found her in the fire, a look she now realized was older than the wildfire, older than the sanctuary. It was the look of an animal who had survived too much, lost too much, and yet, somehow, chosen to trust again. That afternoon, Ella sat on the porch, coffee growing cold in her hands, lost in thought. She was joined by her neighbor, Mrs. Diaz, who brought over a basket of fresh eggs and sat with her in companionable silence. "They say you got a miracle horse in your barn?" Mrs. Diaz said after a while. "I say, she's got a miracle woman watching out for her?" Ella smiled weakly. "She's not mine. Not really." "Maybe she never will be?" Mrs. Diaz nodded, eyes wise and kind. "Sometimes it's not about who owns what. It's about who shows up when it matters." Late that night, unable to sleep, Ella walked out to the corral under a sky spangled with stars. Sierra stood watch, as always, Dusty dozing at her feet. Ella leaned against the fence, whispering, "You've survived fire, abandonment, and captivity. Just to choose here? Sierra's ears flicked, her gaze unreadable in the darkness. But as the wind rustled through the grass, Ella swore she felt a silent answer, a promise, unspoken, echoing in the night. The world was changing, and soon, she knew, someone would come knocking. But for now, in the hush of the Arizona night, all that mattered was the trust quietly blooming between a battered horse, her fragile foal, and the woman who refused to let them go. Summer storms in Arizona had a way of sneaking up on you. One moment, the air hung heavy and quiet. The next, the sky was alive with black clouds and distant thunder. On the fifth night, after discovering Sierra's brand, Ella was inside the sanctuary's kitchen, coaxing a stubborn generator back to life. Outside, rain spat against the windows, wind bending the old cottonwoods, electricity flickering as lightning licked the horizon. Most of the animals were restless, shifting in their stalls or pacing the fence lines. Even the dogs kept close, tails tucked, every boom making them jump. In the main barn, Sierra and Dusty had found their rhythm. The foal's limp had faded, and his spirit was growing bolder. Lately, he'd begun to wander further from his mother's side, exploring every corner of his new world. Sierra tolerated his curiosity, but never let him stray for long, corralling him with a nudge or a snort if he got too bold. That evening, as the first drops of rain began to fall, Dusty pranced along the fence line, chasing after the swirling leaves and sniffing at puddles. Ella noticed between chores how Sierra had grown tense, ears twitching, eyes scanning the sky. Something about the air put all the animals on edge. The storm, when it finally broke, came hard and fast. Rain battered the tin roof, wind howled down the gully, and the world outside the barn turned silver with water. At some point during the chaos, a latch on the side gate worked loose. Ella would later blame herself for not checking it one last time. But in truth, the sanctuary was a patchwork of old fences and quick fixes. Dusty, drawn by the rush of water and wild energy in the air, found the opening and slipped through before Sierra could stop him. It happened quickly, a flash of gray, a desperate nicker, the snap of hooves on wet earth. Sierra gave chase at once, her shrill cry splitting the storm. Ella heard it above the thunder and dropped everything, racing to the porch. She caught sight of Dusty's small frame darting toward the flooded arroyo that marked the edge of her property, the gate swinging uselessly on its hinge. Without hesitation, Ella grabbed her flashlight and keys and sprinted to her truck, boots skidding in the mud. The headlights carved through the rain, sweeping the pasture in frantic arcs. Every shadow looked like a foal, every fallen branch a sign of disaster. She shouted Dusty's name, her voice lost in the wind. Sierra was ahead of her, muscles bunching and stretching, mane plastered to her neck by the rain. She ran with a single-minded focus that sent chills through Ella. Even in her panic, the mare moved like something born of the storm, wild and relentless. Ella followed, truck bouncing over ruts, windshield wipers barely keeping up. In the dark, everything was confusion, a mess of water, brush, and swirling wind. At the edge of the property, where the arroyo was swollen and churning, Ella caught the beam of her flashlight on a shape tangled in a thicket. Dusty, legs splayed, stuck in the muddy ditch, water rising fast. He struggled weakly, whinnying in terror. "Hold on, baby. Just hold on," Ella shouted, her voice ragged as she jumped out into the storm. Her boots sank in mud up to her ankles as she fought her way through the undergrowth, heart hammering so loudly she could barely think. Sierra arrived at the ditch a heartbeat later, circling Dusty with desperate energy, head low, nostrils flaring, calling to her foal. She didn't panic or run. She stood between the rushing water and the colt, pressing her flank against him, shielding him from the wind and rain with her body. Ella waded into the ditch, water up to her knees, hands trembling as she grabbed Dusty's slippery haunches and tried to lift him free. The mud sucked at his legs, but he kicked feebly, finally finding enough purchase to scramble up the bank with Ella's help. Sierra let out a long, guttural sound, half warning, half encouragement, never moving far, never letting the storm win. Together, they heaved Dusty out of the flood. He collapsed against Sierra's side, gasping, chest heaving with each breath. Ella crouched beside them, soaked to the skin, arms wrapped around herself as she tried to catch her breath. For a long moment, all three stood in the rain, the storm screaming around them, united by fear, relief, and something wordless. Then, for the first time, Sierra pressed her muzzle to Ella's shoulder, a gesture so gentle, so full of gratitude and exhaustion that Ella nearly broke down. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth and weight of the mare's trust settle through her, chasing away the chill. "Thank you," Ella whispered, unsure if she was speaking to the mare, the universe, or herself. "We're okay. We're okay now." They limped back to the barn in the dark, Sierra's body sheltering Dusty, Ella's hand resting on the colt's back, guiding him through the mud. The storm began to fade, the thunder moving off into the hills, leaving the world soaked and silent in its wake. Inside the barn, Ella dried Dusty as best she could, wrapping him in towels, checking for cuts and bruises. Sierra hovered close, nuzzling her foal, licking his ears, making soft, reassuring noises. Ella watched the mare's eyes, so bright and full of life despite everything, and felt the old ache of wonder in her chest. She thought about all the ways trust could be broken: gates left open, storms unpredicted, wounds that ran deeper than skin. And she thought about the ways trust could be restored: a hand in the darkness, a sheltering body, a silent thank you pressed gently to the shoulder of someone who simply showed up. Later that night, as Dusty slept curled up against Sierra's side, Ella sat in the straw, exhausted but grateful. She knew that storms, like scars, left their mark, but sometimes they also wash the world clean. She closed her eyes and let the barn's familiar sounds, breathing, shifting, the soft snuffles of a recovering foal, lull her towards sleep. Outside, the rain faded to a gentle patter. Inside, three survivors rested together, changed but unbroken, bound by a story written in storm and mud in the quiet promise of a new day. Dawn, after the storm arrived, clean and sharp, air smelling of wet earth and renewal. The world seemed to shimmer, everything washed bright and fresh by the night's chaos. Willow Ridge felt quieter, as if every animal knew they'd survived something together. Dusty slept late, worn out by his ordeal, and even Sierra stood relaxed for the first time, her body no longer tense and coiled. Ella moved through her chores in a grateful daze, checking every latch and fence line, her hands still shaking a little from the memories of mud and rushing water. But beneath her relief, something cold gnawed at her, a sense that peace was fragile, temporary. The government brand on Sierra's flank haunted her dreams. Each day, she checked her phone for a call or a message from the BLM, dreading the moment someone would come to take Sierra away. That moment came not as a call, but as a letter. Late that morning, the mail truck left a single large envelope at Ella's battered mailbox. She opened it with a knot in her stomach. Inside, she found a formal letter with the Bureau of Land Management's seal at the top, along with legal documents, forms, and a short, handwritten note clipped to the first page. To whom it may concern, I am hereby filing for reclamation of the mare known as Sierra, previously registered to my ranch. As her legal adopter, I request immediate return of said animal. Warren Blaine, Blaine Shows. Horses, Carson City, Nevada. Ella felt the blood drain from her face. She read the letter twice, then 3 times, as if some hidden kindness might emerge between the legal jargon. But it was all there, in black and white. Warren Blaine, a wealthy show horse breeder whose name she vaguely recognized from horse magazines and the internet, was claiming Sierra as his property. Frustration burned in Ella's chest. She walked the length of the sanctuary, letter crumpled in her fist, trying to clear her head. The thought of Sierra being loaded onto a trailer and shipped back to a ranch hundreds of miles away felt unthinkable. She could still see the scars under Sierra's coat, the haunted intelligence in her eyes. She remembered Sierra standing against the storm, protecting Dusty with a mother's ferocity. How could any law call that loyalty property? Ella called Nate, her BLM contact, voice shaking with anger. You can't let this happen, Nate. She's not a thing to be owned. She chose to stay here. She chose her foal. She chose us. Nate sighed. Ella, I get it. Believe me, but the law's clear. If Blaine can prove legal ownership and files the paperwork, there's not much the Bureau can do. We're already getting calls from the media. Somebody leaked your story. My story? Ella echoed, thrown off balance. Yeah, that video of the rescue went viral again. People are sharing pictures of Sierra and Dusty everywhere. Animal rights groups, horse sanctuaries, they're all watching. You might not want the spotlight, but it's coming whether you like it or not. That same afternoon, a local news van pulled into Willow Ridge, tires crunching over gravel. A young reporter in a blue rain jacket stepped out, her cameraman following. Ella didn't want to talk, but they were polite, persistent, and, she realized, possibly her only chance to tell Sierra's side of the story. They filmed Sierra standing guard over Dusty, her gray coat gleaming in the sun, scars visible, but her spirit unbroken. The reporter asked, "Why do you think Sierra followed you 5 miles that day?" Ella looked straight into the lens, swallowing her nerves. Because she didn't have to run anymore. She was choosing something. Not safety, not offense. She was choosing trust. She chose her foal, and she chose to stay. She hesitated, then added, "You can't own trust. You have to earn it." The news story aired that night on local TV, then was picked up by larger outlets. Within 24 hours, Ella's phone exploded with calls, texts, and emails. Some were from old friends or strangers offering help. Others came from horse lovers, veterans, parents, people who saw themselves in Sierra's story. Still, the threat of legal action hung over it all, heavy and relentless. The following morning, 2 men in a spotless pickup truck rolled up to the front gate. They wore tailored jeans and crisp shirts with the Blaine Show Horses logo stitched over the pocket. They carried paperwork, clipboards, and an attitude of practiced authority. "We're here for the Mare," the older one announced, handing Ella a copy of the court order. Ella's jaw clenched. "You can't just take her? She's not a lost bicycle. She's a living, breathing creature with her own choices. You know what she survived to get here?" "We know she's registered to Mr. Blaine," the man said, unmoved. "And unless you want to get arrested for obstruction, I suggest you help us load her up." Sierra, sensing the tension, stood between the men and Dusty, head high, eyes bright with challenge. Dusty pressed into her side, trembling. The 2 Blaine men tried to approach, but Sierra refused to move, stamping her hoof, teeth bared, making her boundaries clear. A crowd began to gather. Neighbors, sanctuary volunteers, even a couple of local sheriff's deputies who'd come to keep the peace. Cameras rolled as the standoff played out. One of Ella's oldest friends, a retired Army nurse, stood next to her and whispered, "You're not alone, Elle. Not anymore." Word spread fast. By that afternoon, TV trucks lined the gravel road. People showed up with protest signs, "Let her stay," and "Horses are family, not property." The story took on a life of its own. Social media flooded with images of Sierra and Dusty, the wild mare who followed a promise, the foal who survived fire and flood. That night, as the sun sank behind the blackened hills, Ella sat beside Sierra and Dusty in the barn, brushing out the mare's tangled mane. "We're not giving up," she promised, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You're not alone, either. Not ever again." For the first time since the storm, Sierra let her head rest against Ella's shoulder, her eyes closing as if, at least for tonight, she could believe it was true. The next morning dawned with a restless energy rolling over Willow Ridge. It was as if the animals sensed something brewing, a tension in the air that made even the dogs uneasy. Ella barely slept. She spent the small hours watching over Sierra and Dusty, nerves raw and heart pounding every time headlights swept past on the highway. She checked the fences again and again, tightening latches, reinforcing gates, doing anything to distract herself from the growing fear that soon someone would come to take Sierra away. By sunrise, it was clear that the news story had spread far beyond their small town. Cars and trucks lined the road outside the sanctuary, locals, out-of-towners, animal lovers, even a few curious strangers drawn by the viral story of the wild mare who chose to stay. Ella felt overwhelmed, not just by the sheer number of people, but by the handmade signs they carried. Some held up posters. "You don't own trust. You earn it." Others wore old army jackets or carried American flags. A few children, clutching stuffed horses, asked Ella if Sierra was okay. Every face was earnest, and every eye seemed to silently beg, "Don't let them take her." At first, the show of support made Ella nervous. She wasn't used to crowds, especially ones that came with TV cameras and questions she couldn't answer. But as the morning wore on, her fear turned to something steadier, a quiet sense of resolve. She watched as her friends and neighbors moved along the fence line, linking arms, creating a living barrier between Willow Ridge and the rest of the world. Old farmers in overalls stood beside teenagers with nose rings. A school teacher with a sunflower tattoo held hands with a grocery clerk in muddy boots. Even the local pastor showed up, saying a quiet prayer for wisdom and protection. Sierra watched the gathering from the safety of the main corral, Dusty pressed against her side. She seemed to understand that something was different, that the humans who filled the driveway were not a threat, but a shield. For once, her body relaxed, her ears flicking with curiosity rather than fear. Mid-morning brought a convoy of white trucks rumbling up the gravel drive, windows reflecting the sun. At the head of the line, a Bureau of Land Management trailer carried the government seal and an array of equipment: catch poles, tranquilizer guns, and ropes. The agents who stepped out wore crisp uniforms and hard expressions, accompanied by two deputies who looked far less sure of themselves. The lead agent, a tall woman named Phillips, walked up to Ella with a clipboard in hand. "We're here to take custody of the mare, known as Sierra," she said, voice businesslike. "We don't want trouble, but this is now a federal matter." Ella squared her shoulders, trembling but resolute. "She's not just a case number. She's a survivor. She's part of our community now." Agent Phillips barely glanced at the crowd. "Ma'am, we have the authority to remove her by force, if necessary. Please step aside." But no one moved. One by one, the people along the fence locked their arms tighter. The local veterinarian, Dr. Fields, stepped forward. "I'll lose my license for this, but you'll have to arrest me before you take her." Others murmured their agreement. The sheriff's deputies looked at each other, then quietly stepped back, making it clear where their loyalties lay. Tension crackled like static. The BLM agents conferred in low voices, eyeing the peaceful blockade. News crews jostled for the best shot, microphones pointed at the standoff. Ella caught a glimpse of herself on someone's live stream, face streaked with dirt, hair wild, eyes fierce with worry and hope. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then, as if on cue, the crowd began to chant, "Let her stay! Let her stay!" The voices grew louder, a living wall of sound echoing down the valley. Sierra lifted her head, nostrils flaring, and for a moment, it felt as if the earth itself paused to listen. The lead agent tried once more. "This is your last warning," she called, but even her voice wavered. She looked over the crowd, at the homemade signs, the small children perched on parents' shoulders, the wounded veterans with their service dogs. Something in her face softened. A local news reporter caught the moment and swung her microphone toward the gate, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're seeing it live, folks. A community coming together, not just for a horse, but for what she represents." Finally, with a heavy sigh, Agent Phillips lowered her clipboard. "We'll withdraw for now, but this isn't over. You'll be hearing from our legal team." The BLM team retreated to their trucks, engines grumbling as they pulled away, trailed by cheers and relieved laughter. Ella felt her legs give way, relief so strong it left her dizzy. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, overwhelmed by gratitude as friends crowded around, hugging her, clapping her back, promising they'd be there as long as it took. That afternoon, the crowd thinned but did not disappear. People brought food, flowers, and donations. Sacks of feed, stacks of hay, envelopes pressed into Ella's hand. Children drew pictures of Sierra and Dusty, taping them to the sanctuary gate. Someone hung a homemade banner on the fence. "You don't own trust. You earn it." In the soft golden light of evening, Ella stood in the paddock with Sierra and Dusty, letting her hands rest on their warm, steady bodies. Sierra pressed her head gently into Ella's chest, breathing out a sigh as if, for the first time, she felt truly safe. Ella whispered, "We're not finished fighting, girl, but you've got an army now." As dusk settled over Willow Ridge, the sanctuary glowed with hope, a fence line not of wood or wire, but of people, hearts, and the unbreakable bond between a wild horse, her chosen family, and a community that refused to look away. In that moment, Ella understood. True protection didn't come from laws or paper, but from the courage to stand together, no matter the odds. 2 nights had passed since the standoff at Willow Ridge, but for Ella, time felt both stretched and uncertain, as if every hour might bring the next disaster, or, impossibly, a final peace. The sanctuary was quiet now, the fences standing strong, the crowd of supporters having dwindled to a few loyal volunteers and friends who camped out in case the BLM returned. They ate chili by the fire, told stories, kept a lookout, but the white trucks never came back. Still, sleep wouldn't come. Ella moved like a ghost through the night, checking the locks, scanning the dark fields for headlights, always half expecting trouble. The pressure of the past week, fire, flood, and the threat of losing Sierra sat heavy in her chest. Sometimes she'd wake with a start, convinced she'd heard the squeal of trailer brakes, only to realize it was just the wind in the grass. On the 3rd morning, she woke early, long before sunrise. The sky outside was washed in deep blue and violet, the kind of cold, clear dawn that feels endless. Ella slipped on her boots and padded out to the barn, more from habit than hope. She found the animals dozing, the dogs curled by the door, chickens barely stirring. She was halfway to the main corral when she saw it. The gate, hanging wide open. For a moment she froze, mind blank with confusion. She'd checked it before bed, she was sure of it. A sick feeling grew in her gut as she hurried to the paddock, boots squelching in dew-soaked grass. Sierra and Dusty were gone. Ella's heart hammered in her chest. She searched the barn, the fields, every corner of the property, calling their names, her voice growing more desperate with each passing minute. No answer came. No hoofprints, no trail in the soft earth, nothing but the hush of early morning and the slow, creeping light. It was as if the mare and her foal had simply vanished into the mist. She collapsed against the fence, breath coming in ragged bursts, eyes stinging. Grief and disbelief tangled inside her. For all her vigilance, all her fighting, she'd lost them anyway. The world suddenly felt too big, the fields too empty. Then, on the front porch, she noticed something new, a folded slip of paper wedged beneath an old horseshoe nailed to the doorframe. Ella's hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, blocky and simple. Sometimes the wild knows when it's time to walk away. That was all. No signature, no explanation, just a gentle, almost loving goodbye. Ella stood on the porch for a long time, letting the words sink in. She replayed the last few days, the storm, the standoff, the crowds chanting at her gate. Sierra had never belonged to anyone. Not really. She had chosen to stay when it mattered. And maybe now, she was choosing again. It wasn't abandonment. It was freedom. It was the lesson she'd been teaching all along. As the sun crested the horizon, Ella's sorrow eased, replaced by a bittersweet gratitude. She imagined Sierra and Dusty slipping through the dawn, wild and free, following instincts older than any fence or law. She hoped they'd find a place untouched by fire and fear, a place where no one could cage them, not even out of love. Throughout the day, neighbors and volunteers drifted in, asking after the mare and foal. Ella met each question with a sad but genuine smile. "They're gone," she told them. "They made their choice. Maybe it's what was meant to happen all along." She showed them the note, and the message spread quietly among the community. Nobody spoke of defeat. Instead, they remembered the miracle of Sierra's walk, the bond she shared with Dusty, and the trust that had grown between wild hearts and human hands. News crews came, hoping for drama, but found only a woman and her empty barn. Ella refused interviews, turning away microphones and cameras, gently redirecting visitors to the other animals who still needed homes. She spent that afternoon cleaning out Sierra and Dusty's stall, carefully folding the blanket Dusty used, brushing out the last stray hairs from the old straw. It felt like a farewell, but not an end. Before dusk, she took one final walk along the fence line, scanning the far hills for any sign, a flash of silver, a flick of a foal's tail. But the land was silent. The world felt both emptier and more sacred, as if something holy had passed through and left its mark. Back in the kitchen, Ella pinned Sierra's note above her desk, beside the emergency plans and lists of chores. She stared at it, remembering everything that had happened, every moment when hope seemed lost and trust seemed impossible. She realized that, despite the pain, she wouldn't have chosen differently. She would have opened the gate again and again for as long as it took, even knowing how it would end. That night, as she sat alone on the porch with her old dog in the soft Arizona wind, Ella smiled through her tears. She whispered a quiet blessing to the dark, wherever Sierra and Dusty had gone. Thank you for choosing to stay. Thank you for teaching me to let go. In the end, it wasn't about winning or losing, keeping or losing. None of it was ever truly about ownership. It was about trust given and received, about loving without chains, about understanding when it's time to hold on, and when it's time to set someone free. And though she was alone, Ella didn't feel abandoned. She felt released by the wild, by hope, by the certainty that sometimes the greatest act of love is to simply open the gate and let them go. For weeks after Sierra and Dusty's quiet departure, the sanctuary moved in a hush that felt both peaceful and strange. Every morning, Ella still walked the fence line, pausing at the open gate where the grass now grew a little taller, as if the earth itself wanted to remember. She missed the rhythm of Sierra's hooves, the cautious trust in her eyes, and the way Dusty's awkward gallop would brighten even the darkest day. Their absence left an ache, but also a space that slowly began to fill with purpose. People didn't forget. The story of the wild mare and her foal continued to ripple far beyond Willow Ridge. It showed up in newspapers and on the radio, but more than that, it settled into the hearts of the community. Neighbors who once only waved in passing now stopped to talk. They shared memories of the fence line standoff, the banners, the chants of "let her stay," and how, for a little while, everyone had felt part of something bigger, something good. Ella spent the early days cleaning the sanctuary, fixing what she could, mending fences and hearts alike. But soon, letters started to arrive, first a trickle, then a flood. Some came from local folks who'd stood with her on the fence, others from faraway places, Colorado, New York, even Canada, written by strangers who'd followed Sierra's journey online. Many letters were short, simple notes of encouragement. Thank you for fighting. You gave her a choice. Some came from parents who read the story to their children at bedtime. Others were from veterans and survivors, men and women who recognized themselves in Sierra. She reminded me that you don't have to be tamed to be healed. Moved by these words, Ella felt a stirring inside her that wouldn't let her rest. She realized that Sierra's story wasn't just hers. It belonged to anyone who'd ever felt caged, lost, or forced to choose between freedom and belonging. She wanted to honor what the mare had given, and so, in the quiet after their leaving, Ella began to write. She called her memoir, "When the Wilds Stay." It started as scribbled notes on napkins and feed bills, then pages in a battered notebook. She wrote about the wildfire, about the day she found Dusty in the cage, and Sierra stepped through the flames. She wrote about the long walk behind the truck, the trust that grew day by day, the silent conversations and the standoff at the fence. She wrote about letting go, and about how the wild sometimes chooses you, how sometimes the best you can do is open your arms and promise to never turn away. As the chapters grew, so did the reach of her words. Friends who read early drafts encouraged her to send them out. The book was picked up by a small publisher who was moved by the honesty and hope in her storytelling. It didn't become a blockbuster overnight, but the quiet power of Sierra's story began to spread. People ordered copies for their friends, their libraries, their classrooms. A reviewer called it a love letter to trust, resilience, and the courage to let go. Ella wasn't much for public speaking, but invitations began to arrive. At first, she went only to local events, veterans support groups, animal shelters, schools. Standing in front of strangers, Ella told the story of Sierra not just as a tale of a wild horse, but as a lesson in the complexity of healing. She spoke about her time in the military, about trauma and survival, about how sometimes the things that save us are the ones we can't control. In these rooms, she saw how people listened, not just to her, but to the message woven into Sierra's journey. Healing doesn't mean taming, she'd say quietly. Sometimes it just means not walking away. Faces softened. People nodded, cried, even laughed. For some, it was the first time they'd felt seen or understood. For others, it was the reminder they needed. That wounds, seen or unseen, don't have to keep us from connection. As the book gained momentum, a well-known equine therapy center reached out, inviting Ella to help design a new program for veterans coping with PTSD and loss. She poured her heart into the project, naming the pasture Sierra's Second Chance Field. There, men and women who'd known the chaos of war and the sting of isolation could walk beside rescued horses, some gentle, some wild, all bearing their own scars. They learned, as Ella had, that healing sometimes required stillness, patience, and the willingness to let trust grow at its own pace. On opening day, as Ella cut the ribbon beside the field, she looked out at the crowd. Faces young and old, former soldiers and nervous children, all gathered by the power of a story. In the paddock, a dappled Mustang stood apart, eyes wary but unbroken. She saw herself in that horse, saw Sierra's spirit everywhere, in the quiet, in the courage, in the refusal to walk away. That night, after the last guests had left, Ella wandered the fields alone, dusk falling gently over Willow Ridge. She paused at the edge of Sierra's old paddock, listening to the evening sounds. Crickets, the soft clatter of hooves, the hush of wind in the grass. For a moment she imagined she could hear Sierra's breath, feel Dusty's playful nudge. She realized that, in the end, the wild didn't truly leave. It changed forms, found new hearts, seeded new beginnings. The story of Sierra and Dusty became a kind of anthem at the sanctuary, a story told to every new volunteer, every child who visited, every lost soul looking for hope. The lesson echoed in every quiet moment, every gentle touch between person and animal. You don't have to be tamed to belong. You don't have to be perfect to be loved. Ella understood now that she hadn't rescued Sierra. Not really. It was the Mare who had rescued her, showing her how to listen, how to wait, how to open the gate and trust what came in, and, when the time came, how to let it go again. Years passed, but the story of Sierra and Dusty never faded from Willow Ridge or from Ella Carter's heart. Time has a way of weathering pain, of blurring even the brightest flames, but there are some memories that grow sharper with every retelling. As Ella settled into the slower rhythm of her later years, the sanctuary continued to flourish, shaped and colored by the legacy of the wild mare who once chose to stay. Sierra's Second Chance Field had become more than a pasture for rescued horses. It was now a sanctuary for people too, a living metaphor for everything the wild mare had taught Ella. Dozens of veterans had passed through the program, some learning to trust again for the first time since coming home. Others simply finding peace in the presence of animals who asked nothing of them but patience and truth. Children who once trembled at the thought of horses now laughed as they led gentle Mustangs along the fence line, their fear melting into wonder and pride. The story continued to spread, finding new life each year. Ella's memoir quietly climbed bestseller lists, surprising her with letters from readers all over the world. She was invited to conferences and podcasts, and even once spoke at a university about the power of nonverbal trust. She always told them she was no hero. The truth is, we think we rescue animals, she'd say, her voice warm with humility. But sometimes, it's the animals who rescue us, from our own fences, our own certainties, our own need to control the world. One crisp autumn afternoon, with the air tinged by the promise of winter, Ella sat for her final recorded interview. The journalist was young, gentle, respectful, a woman who had grown up reading about Sierra and Dusty and had come all the way from Chicago just to see Willow Ridge in person. The interview took place on the old porch, sun slanting through the cottonwoods, wind rustling the grass. The woman asked, "Looking back, what do you think Sierra gave you that you didn't have before?" Ella thought for a long time, fingers tracing the lines in her weathered hands. Maybe it's this. We spend so much of our lives trying to save things, to protect what matters. We put up fences, literal and otherwise, thinking it's the only way to keep anything safe. But the wild and love don't really work that way. Sierra never spoke. She never begged. She just stayed. She gave her trust, her loyalty, because she chose to, not because anyone forced her. And maybe that's the most powerful act of love, staying without asking anything in return. The journalist smiled, her eyes shining. "And Dusty?" A laugh flickered in Ella's throat, both joyful and wistful. "He grew up strong and wild, just like his mother. I still get photos from ranchers who spot a silver mare and a big roan stallion running free out past the mesas. Sometimes I think I see them at dusk, just at the edge of the fields. But even if I never see them again, I know they're out there. They chose their path." As the sun dipped lower, Ella walked the visitor through the fields, pointing out the old corral where Sierra had stood guard over Dusty, the paddock gate that had once been left open, the fence line where the community had linked arms and refused to back down. Every space, every shadow, seemed infused with memory. She paused by the plaque at Sierra's second chance field. It read, "You don't own trust. You earn it." Later that week, alone with her thoughts and her old dog at her feet, Ella sat at her desk and looked over the pile of letters she'd received over the years, words of hope, thanks, and transformation. She realized that Sierra's greatest gift wasn't just the story of survival, but the lesson she'd left behind. True loyalty is never taken. It's given, and real protection doesn't control. It lets go when it must. And sometimes, those who choose to stay say more than those who beg to be heard. She wrote those words down, tears pricking her eyes. For so long, she'd tried to fix, to save, to hold on. But Sierra had shown her that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to trust, to let go, and to stay. Not because you have to, but because you want to. That kind of staying changed everything. It changed a sanctuary. It changed a community. It changed a woman who once thought her only purpose was to keep the world at bay. The final chapter of Ella's story wasn't about loss or regret. It was about legacy, about what we leave behind in the quiet spaces of others' hearts. She saw it in the veterans who led wild horses through fields and in the children who painted pictures of Dusty and Sierra for the barn wall. She saw it in every open gate, every mended fence, every act of kindness that rippled outward from a single wild mare's decision to follow a promise instead of a rope. In the twilight of her life, Ella finally understood. The fences we build to keep the world out are nothing compared to the bridges we create when we let trust in. In the end, we become what we protect, whether that's a lost foal, a scarred Mustang, or the wild hope that healing is possible, even after the fire has burned everything we know. On our last evening at Willow Ridge, Ella stood by the pasture as the sun sank behind the distant mesas, painting the sky in gold and rose. Far off, at the edge of vision, a silver-gray mare galloped across the ridge, a grown stallion thundering at her side, manes flying in the wind. She watched until they vanished into the horizon, feeling no sadness, only gratitude. And so the story faded into legend. A wild mare who chose to stay. A woman who learned to let go. In a world changed not by control or conquest, but by the quiet power of trust, earned and given again and again. The journey of Sierra and Dusty, and of Ella herself, teaches us that love is not possession and protection is not control. True loyalty is a gift, freely given, never demanded. The greatest bonds are built not with ropes or fences, but with trust, patience, and the courage to let others choose their own path. Sometimes the most powerful act isn't to hold on, but to open the gate and believe in the strength of what you've nurtured. For in letting go, we find what's truly worth keeping. Thank you for joining this journey. If this story moved you, please like and follow the channel so that more people can discover tales of hope, healing, and the power of choosing to stay.